Hi, and welcome to The Four-Dimensional Nightmare by J G Ballard. Now, I know I've gloated about this book once or twice before, at least once when I found it in a haul, because it's this beautiful penguin with this marvelous cover, and I was really impressed by it, and I am still really impressed by it. I also reviewed the first story on its own on YouTube at some stage. That first story is called The Voices of Time. I gave it 5 stars. It was a wild and beautifully written story. It was speculative. It was about a world where large-scale narcolepsy syndrome is occurring, and our protagonist, who's a scientist working in an institution that deals with the narcolepsy, can feel the early onset in himself. There's a whole heap of other stuff. There's an alien intelligence messed in there somewhere, and there's a whole heap of radiation causing mutation of animals. Anyway, that review is out there on the YouTube somewhere, so by all means go and look for it. Today I'll try and concentrate on the story, the book as a whole. Now, notoriously I don't do New Year's resolutions, but if I'd had a New Year's resolution for 2025, it would be to read more short stories, because I am that person. I say I don't like short stories, and in many ways I really don't often enjoy reading short story collections. But there's no doubting that classic science fiction and fantasy, its genesis is in short story collections, in the magazines. As we know it today, science fiction wouldn't exist if it wasn't for them. And so many of these authors that I really enjoy wrote mostly short stories. So, in pursuit of that, more short stories. Now, Ballard I was excited for. I think his writing is beautiful and rich and evocative. I think it's always beautiful writing, no matter what. I haven't always loved his novels. I think it gives him too much space to become self-indulgent, go off plot, and kind of fly off the handle, and his narrative just goes off the rails. And I know he's trying to make a point with that a lot of the time, but I think in the novels it doesn't always work. But that is never a problem in his short stories, because he's got limited space. None of these stories are that short. We've got a 223-page book with only 8 stories, and that gives Ballard plenty of space to flex that considerable imagination that he's got, visualize things, pad them out, use that imagery and delve deep into that human connection, psychology, weirdness that he excels in at so much. So, and all these stories are very, very immersive. All of them have questions, all of them make you think, and Ballard is very poetic and literary, but his stories always come with a bite. So there's quite a few of these stories I think are in a Penguin science fiction collection. A few of them aren't technically science fiction, they're more avant-garde. And even the ones that are science fiction, there's that deep trend that sort of creeps into psychological horror, like a Ray Bradbury story perhaps. The horror isn't overt, but there's always something dark in those depths, if you know what I'm saying. So the second story, which I haven't reviewed, is called The Sound Sweep, and I loved it just as much as I loved the first one. In a future that is never detailed in any great detail, but is clearly our world, our time, but ahead of time, there's a fading opera singer, and she's living on a deserted soundstage that's slowly decaying in a deserted theatre. These descriptions are lush and edgy. They're descriptions of a decaying talent who has never lost her star power but has lost everything else. And she still has that bombastic, over-the-top style of many opera singers. My godmother was an opera singer, so I'm acquainted. Ballard wrote her really, really well. Her name is Madame Gioconda. And around about midnight when the story starts, she's waiting for the sound sweep, the contractor who comes around with his machinery and removes the residue of accumulated sounds. These sounds torment her. And we get the sense of a world in which A contract cleaner goes around many places and sweeps up sound, removes the residue of traffic noises, of scenes that have happened in the house in the past. And eventually he arrives. Mangon is dumb and he absolutely worships Madame Gurkonda. He cleans her house for nothing every day but for the chance to hear her stories and spend time with her. So again, Ballard, there are twists, and I'm not going to tell you what they are, but they are well worth reading. And this sense of fading glory about the story is just amazing. Third story is Prima Belladonna. I gave this one 4 stars when I was reviewing them. I really think that, again, Ballard is one of those authors that you can only really review his stars within Ballard universe. So it's 4 stars compared to some of the others, because some of them I loved a lot more and were 5 stars. But if you compare Ballard with many other authors who are very famous, all of his are like 10 stars out of 5. So just saying that. So Prima Belladonna has a delightful premise, but it does go a little bit all over the shop compared to some of the tighter stories in this collection. Again, Ballard is using the imagery of sound. So our main protagonist runs a shop full of singing botany. This is little shop of horror style botany, only again, we've got a world in which this seems to be considered routine. So he's got the Khan arachnid orchid, which has a range of 24 octaves and requires tuning with a UV lamp. And he's got all these other bushes that sing notes, basically a whole florist shop, only all the vegetation sings or produces music in some way. That is kind of secondary part of the story. The primary part of the story is about this beautiful, possibly part mutant, we are told, neighbor who moves in across the way. The narrator and his also male friends shamelessly stare through her window, ogling her when she arrives. This gives you a bit of flashbacks to The Green Millennium by Fritz Leiber, and also shades to the early 60s when this was written. I don't know how many people in the 2000s would write a group of men staring into a woman's window without making it intentionally creepy, but apparently in the 60s it wasn't as creepy as I really feel that like it always should have been. Never mind. So this woman is a singer, and with her voice she can make people see things. As our protagonist finds out, all the guys want to be with her, but he apparently ends up with her. Why is she with him? He does wonder, but maybe it's the orchids in his shop. She has an obsession with the narrator's orchid, and this is a very, very strange story with a very, very strange ending, which I'm not in any way going to disclose. Far more is left unexplained than is explained. And the world that Ballard builds, well, it feels very this world only a short step into the future. It's got some strange oddities and very few answers, but only questions. And some of the things, like they're talking about a recess at some point. I wonder if these are things that Ballard just invented to make the world real, or if these are things that someone in the 60s would have understood that I really just didn't. But whichever it is, it makes it feel futuristic, and I enjoyed that. So the 4th story is Studio 5, The Stars. This is one that I read not that long ago. My goal to read 1 short story per week flew out the window when I got into this. I just gulped it down. Hopefully I gave it enough time in between short stories that I'll remember them separately instead of them all melding into one. Studio 5, The Stars is a beautiful, poetic, surreal, a touch psychedelic, I would say. Our narrator is living in Vermilion Sands, a place with quartz reefs, fossil lakes, and sand rays that sort of flap through the skies in an airborne way like bats, only they're clearly rays and they have a sting like a stingray. So, I don't know. The stars is described as a kind of artist colony, specifically writers and poets. Only in this futuristic scenario, all writing, poetry and otherwise, is done using a VT. It's an electronic medium, virtual something or other. I never quite got the hang of what it was. IBM, in the case of our protagonist. But basically they program things into a style, and then the VT writes their actual poems or stories. So a strange neighbor moves in, who is violently opposed to electronic writing media, and she's determined to bring back old school poetry using the medium of our protagonist's magazine that he publishes once a month, I think. And she has some sort of goal to reenact the myth of the muse Melisandre and the fatal destiny of Corydon, I think it's pronounced. I've never actually had to say that word before. I've only ever read it. From Greek mythology. She's got a chauffeur who may or may not be Pan. We're not sure. It's a great story. It's rather prescient, actually, in a way, since these days a university assignment has to be run through a program to see if it's used an AI to write it before it ever comes to the person who's marking it. So aside from that, it's not really exceptionally science fiction-like. It's more psychedelic, poetic, mythic, but it's very prettily written. I really enjoyed it. It certainly seemed to be a similar theme to other Ballard writing. I think I gave that one originally 3 stars, Ballardian scale, because I liked it, but I didn't love it. And that was one which, when I put down the book and was doing something else, I could find myself picking holes in it. But there was a lot there. For a short story, there was a lot. Okay, short story number 5 was The Garden of Time. I gave that 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. It was magnificent. Every second was crystalline and beautiful, just like the time flowers in The Garden of Time. So you've got this couple. It starts with an older gentleman who goes for his evening walk. He looks out from his beautiful house full of small things like mementos and paintings. His wife, you can hear inside playing on the harpsichord. He looks out over his walled garden, and beyond that to the lawn reaching down to the still lake or pond. But then in every other respect, the house is surrounded by dunes and desert. And something comes out of the desert, and in an effort to stop this from happening, he picks these crystalline flowers, and after they're picked, they die. But he and the bungalow go back in time to resist what's coming across the sands. And I'm not going to say anything else about this because it is such a beautiful story. It deserves to be read cold, like I read it, knowing nothing about it, so you can sort of luxuriate in every part of it. And I feel like I'm not doing any service to these stories by saying too much about them. So I'm saying as little as possible while hopefully piquing some people's imagination so that they go and read it. Imagination or curiosity. Story number 6 is The Cage of Sand. 5 stars. A completely different direction to the previous one. And, well, it shared elements with Studio 5 The Stars. It was very, very individualistic as well. So we've got this futuristic world. This is very sci-fi. I think this is the most science fiction story in the lot. We've got a futuristic world where Mars and the Moon have both been settled. But Cape Canaveral has been evacuated, and that whole area is being buried in sand. And not just any sand, but sand from Mars, which carries a virus. Also some moon sand, we gather. Now, the whole area has been evacuated. Our main protagonist is living in a hotel, and we hear that he often has to move up a story as the sand increases. Many places are completely and utterly buried. And the area's been evacuated, and it's being patrolled by wardens who want to get everyone else, but there's out of the area, but there's 3 holdout individuals living there among the deserted motels who go for walks in the sand dunes. And our main protagonist, our main character, is Bridgman. And at one stage he was an architect and he designed the new city of Mars, but his design was knocked out and someone else won the contract, and he's basically retired to this area to do not very much, but evade the wardens. Two other characters are there because of a specific unique phenomenon to this part of the world. This is the clearest spot where you can see a number of spaceships. Now, this story suggests that there's space stations and colonization happening and spaceships going all over the place, but a number of spaceships at some point in the past, and I don't think it's ever really explained why, went up but were unable to dock with the space station, and now they basically orbit the Earth as these small metal coffins within which are the dead astronauts. One of the other two protagonists is the widow of one of those astronauts, and every night she sits there watching these orbiting coffins. And the third one is a failed astronaut, though we don't learn any of this immediately. It emerges organically through the story. So I've actually spoiled quite a bit. Throughout all the stories in this book, this small, slow, steady emergence of information that's given to you is part of the charm. So I probably shouldn't have said anything except just read it, but you know. Okay, The Cage of Sand. This story was unique, and it's got this edge of desperation all the way through, since the wardens keep trying to catch the three and forcibly evacuate them. And there's a sort of nostalgic, ephemeral element to it, because he's wandering around these sands, mostly alone, and we hear about him listening to tapes of people who are gone and going into buildings that have been covered in sand, and you have to sort of sneak down the stairs. It's a really, really strong story, this one. It was great. Number 7 is The Watchtowers. And in this one, Ballard actually goes into a full-on oppressive feeling of impending doom as we follow our main character around our town, city. Where is never disclosed, why is never disclosed. This is more horror than anything else in several regards, which I'm not going to disclose, but the one thing I'll mention is, in this town, which sounds like your basics 50s or 60s type town, only above the town and not very high above it, float these series of watchtowers. He describes the grid pattern, and it just feels like everything is happening under these towers. Do they know who's in them? We don't think so. Do we know why we're there? We don't know. Maybe they don't either. It's hard to describe. I'm not going to try, but the weighting of this story is really phenomenal. Which brings us to the 8th story, which is Chronopolis. And again, this is a totally unique story. We've got an element of, it's not dystopian and it's not post-apocalyptic, but it's a setting that feels like the 50s or 60s, but isn't. And we start with our protagonist is a young boy who starts to become really, really fascinated by all these strange dials that are everywhere that serve no purpose, and which he's not really allowed to ask about, and no one will tell him what they are. And they're watches and clocks. Watches and clocks no longer exist. You can find them in antique stores sometimes, but the hands have been ripped out and they have no mechanism, and his parents won't explain it. Eventually he finds an older teacher who, in an oracular sense, takes him into the center of what used to be this major city and tries to explain why there are no more clocks. I don't think I can really say anything about this story without spoiling it. This one feels less horror and more dystopian, post-apocalyptic, but it's far more social and psychological commentary, and a lot of those commentaries are really, really subtle. You've got the society in which the story happens, you've got the society that it came from, you've got the individual who is our main protagonist, this boy, and his fascination with clocks and time and his yearning to make one. You've got a lot happening, and it's totally worth going there for it. So yes, common themes throughout the story collection, aside from that beautiful writing that I keep raving about, the theme of a colony. Now, as I was reading these stories, I read a little bit more about Ballard, and apparently at some point his second wife, I think it was, introduced him to an artist's colony in France, and that informed a lot of his later writing. But Ballard himself, while he seems to be very interesting, is hard to pinpoint in a lot of ways. So one of the stories in here is actually, I think, either his first or his second published story. This collection, by the way, is first published 1963, and it is a 1963 edition. So the story that is the oldest in here is The Watchtowers, copyright 1956, and I think that must have been one of his first two stories, because his first two stories came out in the 60s that were published. Then most of the others are in the 60s. You've got 1960, 61, 62, etc., etc. 62 is the oldest of any of them, and this is early in his writing career, because I think his last work came out in the 2000s. It might be 2008 from memory. So these ones are all around the same time, but he's got these themes of colony, which apparently allegedly only appeared later in his work, but were clearly there already. He's got the idea of a twist. A couple of his stories have got this mysterious outsider, always female, mysterious outsider female of unknown provenance, whether she's a mutant singer to flowers or something else. There's always a naif element to the characters. Our protagonists are always isolated. They're never one of a crowd. Even though a couple of the males have got their male buddy group, as in Prima Belladonna and another one, but nevertheless, the Studio of the Stars, that was the other one. Nevertheless, our main protagonist is often a bit apart, and sometimes they're completely and utterly apart, as they are in Chronopolis or The Watchtowers. So I did also read that Ballard Starter did at least part of an English literature degree and was originally considered an avant-garde writer. I think you can see the avant-garde a lot more strongly than the classic SF. I also hear that he used to be very contemptuous about routine narratives and routine commentary, and that really comes out because each one of these is unique in its own way. So a couple of them are barely, if at all, science fiction, like I said. Where science occurs, there's not a lot of explanation. It's more science science bolstering up the world in which the story occurs. And yet, some of the science concepts are great, like the VT, which writes all your poems and stories of the future from you. And can I just say, with the AIs and ChatGPT, I'm not sure that we're very far away from that now. And the strong science that you get in The Cage of Sand. So, yeah, brilliant book, brilliant author. Very glad I got it, thoroughly glad I read it. Would recommend to everyone who likes classic SF. If anyone ever starts to feel that classic science fiction is swashbuckling and not literary enough, go for this one. But even if you're not into literature per se and as such, I'm pretty sure that there's going to be something in Ballard for you. Yep. Thank you for watching me rave about these stories, which I don't fully describe and don't fully explain. But even when you're reading them, they're not fully explained, and it's totally worth reading them in every regard. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Read good books. By all means, read this one, because this is one hell of a good book. Bye.